Hey, what's up, guys? It is Donovan and Josh, and we are back here for our final week of the Renew series, and we've been hanging here at the Menlo San Mateo campus. We're here in the staff offices. We've been here all day. I think y'all have been there for like 3 weeks now, and we've been trying to answer this question: what really happens when you begin to follow Jesus? And so far, we've talked about how God reclaims us and gives us a new life and identity as His own. And then we talked about how God then remodels us. He remodels our lives, slowly removing the things that are barriers between us and the best life that He has for us. And He replaces all of those things with things that we need to flourish. And that brings us to our final week here. What are we talking about today, John?
Yeah, so after God works with us to do a little bit of demo in our lives, demo day, right? Removing the things that act as this barrier between us and the vision of flourishing that God has for us. The last step in the process is for God to repurpose us for something new. Like another way of saying that is that God gives us a new purpose. Like whatever we were before, we're something different now. In our last 2 weeks, we've looked at these passages which talk about an old and a new. And so it's time for us to start living into this new identity and purpose. But practically speaking, what does that look like, right?
Well, let's think about it in terms of this building again, right? After all of the checkout lines were replaced with check-in kiosks for kids ministry, and the aisles of shelves were replaced with aisles of chairs, it was time for us as a campus to start using this building in a way that matched its new identity. It had been reclaimed, it had been remodeled, and now it was time for it to be repurposed, which literally means to use something for a different purpose than what it was used for before. We opened up our doors for Sunday morning services, for Menlo students, for kids ministry, for things like Starting Point and Serve Your City. This building's purpose was no longer to sell produce and cereal or even fabric. It had been repurposed to invite people into worship, into community, into a relationship with Jesus.
So being repurposed is really about how we're going to join God in the plan that He has moving forward. The plan that He has for your life, for my life, for your life, for this world. And so naturally that requires action on our part, right? Like just like building, this building began as a space for worship, for housing service projects, and then it began helping people connect with one another. When we're repurposed, we start to do different things than we did before. Listen to how the Apostle Paul puts it in the book of Romans, talking about being repurposed. He says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship."
Offer your bodies as living sacrifices. Now, some of you may be hearing that as I did for the first time hearing it, and you may get a little worried, but don't be too alarmed, because we're not talking about like human sacrifices, right?
We just need you to pick the weakest among you. No, just kidding. No, definitely not talking about that. Paul is actually explaining the new life and new purpose that God is inviting us into. To be a living sacrifice is to consciously say, I'm going to choose the purpose that God has for me. I'm going to set aside maybe the one that I made for myself, because I believe that the purpose that God has for me is greater than anything that I ever could have imagined on my own.
Yeah. And then in verse 9, he continues down in verse 9, and he gives vision. He gives an idea of what kind of life and purpose could look like. He says, and listen to this, and think about how incredible it would be to have a life that looked this way. He says in verse 9, love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good, be devoted to one another in love, honor one another above yourselves, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. And if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Not as crazy as it originally sounded, right? It's not human sacrifices. But I will admit, when I read all of that, when I hear all of that for the first time, it kind of feels like a lot, right? Like it's a lot to do, especially if you're hearing it for the first time. Like, do we have to do all of those things in order to be repurposed?
I think it's a great time to remember what we said at the very beginning of this series, which is that this life of flourishing that God invites us into is a process of change. Meaning it takes time and it doesn't happen all at once. Like, we may start doing some of those things right away. Sure. Some may be easier than others. And in that way, in the way that we're being repurposed, our lives are becoming a part of something new and different than they were before. But the reality is that it takes time.
Yeah. When you say that, it makes me think about, a part of the building that I don't think you guys have gotten to see yet, and I would love to show you if we got time. Let's head up there.
Okay, let's do it.
So what you're looking at is the upper level of our building, which we've affectionately named the loft. And I know that obviously right now in its current condition, it's not very much to look at. We recently got access to the space and we are drawing up plans currently for what we can use it for. But when we were downstairs and you were talking about, this being an ongoing process, being reclaimed and being remodeled and being repurposed, I couldn't help but feel like this is kind of the perfect metaphor for that.
Dude, totally. Like, looking around at this place, it's kind of mid-remodel, right? Like, I think downstairs, we see most of the process is pretty much complete. Like, that room is exactly, it's living into its purpose, totally. But up here, this place has been reclaimed.
Sure.
But it's got some remodeling and repurposing that needs to happen.
Absolutely.
Here.
Yeah. And when I think about, where a lot of us are in our lives, it's kind of where I imagine us being. Like, there are certain areas of our lives that are, like you said, downstairs. They have been reclaimed, they've been remodeled, they've been repurposed. They are living in that new identity in a renewed way, in that God-fashioned life we talked about. But then there are other areas, kind of like this, where there's some work that still needs to be done. And I think that's the really cool thing that we're trying to talk about right now, is that we're still in the process of being renewed. There are some areas that we may not even be aware of, kind of like we weren't really aware of this space, that God still can do some more work on.
Yeah, I think that's so cool. It reminds me of what we talked about towards the beginning, about how God has this dream of a bigger and fuller life for us than we could ever imagine for ourselves. That's like part of the flourishing that he has in mind for us. Like, a couple years ago, you guys didn't even know that this space would ever be available to you, right? And so now there's this like whole area of the San Mateo campus where new kinds of ministry and outreach can take place. There's like so much more flourishing that can happen on this campus now because of the discovery of this place. I feel like it's a perfect metaphor for how God works in our lives. Like, he has so much more vision for our lives, but we'll only discover it if we lean into the process, if we trust that God has a process.
Exactly, yeah. And that's, to me, that's the adventurous thing about following Jesus. When we decide to follow Jesus, we give our lives as these living sacrifices like we talked about, and then we just kind of see what God can do with what we offer to him. And taking all of these different areas and reclaiming them and remodeling them and repurposing them for better things. And then all of these little projects that we get to work on with God make up a renewed life. And it's a process, right? A life that may bear similarities to the one we had before. Like, if you were to stand outside this building and look at it from outside, it looks very similar to the way it did before. But inside, things have been changed, and it's living in this whole new life, this whole new identity. And that's kind of what we're talking about is happening with us.
Okay, so let's try something. Yeah? Should we try something?
Yeah.
Let's try something. As we draw a close on these conversations about what following Jesus actually does in our lives, we want to invite you to imagine that somewhere in your life you have a space that's like the loft. Like there's a space in your life, there's an area of your life that God has already reclaimed, but that you know needs some remodeling, needs some new purpose.
Yeah.
Maybe it's like your relationship with your parents, or the way that you approach dating relationships. It could be about the way that you treat people who are different from you, whether it's different economic background, different ethnic background. I want you to just take a second, think about that area of your life, and I want to invite you, we want to invite you to dream a little bit about what it would look like if God started to remodel that space. If you opened up that space for God to do some remodeling. But instead of us just talking about it and like chatting about it in life groups, here's what we want you to do. In life groups, we're going to invite you to write a letter to your future self, talking about, dreaming about what God could do in that space. Like what would flourishing look like in that area? How could God remodel that space so that you could have a transformed life, renewed by God, used in a new way?
Yeah, I love talking to my future self. In the same way that we might dream about how we could use this space in the loft, we want you to dream about how God may use that area of your life in the future to bring love and goodness and flourishing. And we want you to write it down almost like a prayer, that God may take what you're offering and then completely renew it. Well, this has been a great series, and we're so excited for what you guys are going to get to talk about in life groups. We'll see you next time. We love you guys.